I hope that if I do go to heaven, that it's like the Lake District. Fancy having a great gable in heaven. It'd be wonderful. Flapping around Wasdale Head on your wings. Wonderful.
Towards the end of his life, Alfred Wainwright could no longer make it onto his beloved Lakeland fells, but his memories of the places he explored for almost half a century were as sharp as ever. It's those memories that inspire this walk.
It's the scenery, the freedom, the being able to get away from everything and be alone and think. I was on the fells every weekend, every available moment, and I was astonished at the number of people I met who said, "Can you tell me where we are? Where does this path go to? What mountain is that over there?" Every time I went out, I was stopped by somebody. And I thought, well, I know all this, might be of interest to others. But primarily, as I say, I started to write the guidebooks for my old age. Now old age has come, I can't see them. But I'm a loner, a backroom boy, and I want to get on with my work without interference. So I got completely dedicated with this, writing the guidebooks, and no time for anything else. Every day night after work, try to do a page.
"60 years have gone by since I first ventured into the Valley of Newlands, and I still remember the feeling of rare privilege that accompanied my early wanderings there, an awareness repeated on many subsequent visits. I had come from a home skyline of mill chimneys and huge factories, an environment without beauty, and knew no other. I entered Newlands as a wide-eyed Gulliver in a dream, almost unbelieving that the scene ahead could possibly be real, but it was all true. This was no
A.W.'s eyesight was failing. His wife Betty had to proofread his final books, reading aloud the prose that set Wainwright apart from mere guidebook writers.
And I wandered unchallenged and undisturbed, as in a natural garden of pure delight. No, that should be in a natural garden. Here were no chimney stacks blackened by soot. Here, above a green carpet, was a wonderful surround of peaks, arrayed in colours of purple and russet and gold, as autumn brought summer to an end. I had Newlands to myself on that magic day. I returned home, but in my mind's eye saw only Newlands.
Good?
Good writing.
Good writing, bordering on philosophy, that gently carried his readers from the grand central summits to the rim of the Lake District. And that's where he's going to take us, to the quiet mountains of remote Lakeland. Now, I'm lucky enough to live in remote Lakeland, at the mouth of the Wasdale Valley. But for the next 190 miles or so, I'm going to be introducing you to some of my favourite and Wainwright's favourite corners of this superlative landscape for walkers. With almost 40,000 feet of ascent, it's going to be a challenging walk. Put another way, you're going to do some seriously hard work. Some of the day stages 15, 16, 17 miles long. We've also decided on the high-risk strategy to avoid that rather tedious summer sunshine which flattens out the landscape. We've decided to do the walk in autumn with its shifting light and scudding weather, which means we're going to get seriously wet from time to time. But no matter, get your boots on and stride out with us on what's quite simply one of the best long-distance walks in Britain. There you go.
We walk out through the gentle pastoral landscapes around Penrith, across the fertile plain that stretches from the Pennines to the Lake District. Scarcely a hint here of the towering volcanic and glacial chaos, the eroded wheel of Lakeland mountains, with just a couple of miles ahead. And then we get the first glimpse of our objective, a shimmer of Ullswater and a cloud-capped crown of blue-grey hills beyond. And this is a long-distance walk through more than mere pretty scenery. It's a journey through the brutalities of geological time and the turmoil of more than 5,000 years of human history. This was once the mountain fastness of the men of Reged, the Celtic warriors of one of the most enduring of the British kingdoms, the power in the land after the Romans took their ball home. Their spirit still haunts the high fells, or at least you can imagine it does, in the eerie whistlings of the mountain wind and the shadows of storming, galloping clouds. Letting the imagination run away with me? Probably. But having mentioned it, I bet that one day you feel their presence somewhere on these mountain tops. You probably won't be troubled by ghosts on Great Mell Fell, though. It's an upside-down pudding basin of a hill rising out of the marsh. But at least it gives us a picture window from which to view rather more challenging Lakeland summits up ahead. We can only hope, though, that it's not an indicator of the weather we're going to have to put up with when we reach them.
So, Great Mell Fell welcomes us to high remote Lakeland with a bit of cool and gentle drizzle. But it's worth putting up with the damp because of this. I'd like to be able to show you the Pennines. Can't today, I'm afraid, because that's where the murk's coming from. But this unfolding panorama is going to be our horizon for the next fortnight. Over here we've got the long, flat top of High Street. Then there's the plunge in there, which is Thornthwaite Crag. In the distance, the lit pass, that's Kirkston Pass. To the right of it, the Red Screes. And then we're round to Dove Crag and Fairfield. Round here, Helvellyn Little Man, and then the long run of the Dodds. The little pimple there with the cloud behind it, that's Calf Howe Pike. Dale Head, you can see just peeping over the top on the far horizon. This is Clough Head, and then round again, clouds on the far horizon. There's the rounded shape of Grassmoor, then Grisdale Pike, coming right again, the very sharp summit of Lord's Seat, and now we're into the bulk of Blencathra. And then over here, grey today, hopefully better tomorrow, because that's where we're going, the Callbeck Fells.
On consideration as being a bit unkind about Great Mell Fell, calling it a mere pudding basin, we should be more positive. It's an ideal leg loosener, gets the circulation going in preparation for more strenuous climbs. Thank you, Great Mell Fell. Hate your weather, though. But you'll be pleased to hear it isn't always grey and drizzly. The last time I was in these parts, walking a bit of a detour off our main route, climbing the next summit along the valley, Clough Head, it was a truly sparkling day. I was chatting on the hill with John Dunning, the man who brought the legends of Reged to life in the Reged Centre near Penrith. He's long been one of the champions of remote Lakeland. If you should ever feel guilty about encroaching into these wild places, don't. In John's view, they need you as much as you need them.
On a glorious afternoon like this, you would imagine that you would perhaps see the occasional other walker, wouldn't you? If all the horror stories and scare stories about the Lake District are about to become full are to be believed.
But of course we have in Cumbria a great difficulty that little bits of the national park are at times congested, and that makes some administrators cautious about attracting any more.
Look at this.
Yeah, not a soul in sight, except a silent paraglider, yeah. But it is something which could bring succour to a lot of remote areas which currently don't have sufficient revenue to sustain the community. And certainly in many parts of the national park, the indigenous community is declining very quickly. And in those very beautiful areas, looking after visitors better and in different ways by helping them to enjoy it more could be the means to keep an indigenous community there.
And if you do decide to walk these hills, you'll be following in very famous footsteps, some that even beat Alfred Wainwright to it. John reminded me about the President of the United States who tramped these fells, Woodrow Wilson.
He made several visits. There's something here that touched him that made it worth his while coming and enjoying it again and again. I mean, at home he had the magnificence of Grand Canyon and Yosemite and Yellowstone and tremendous American landscapes. What was the quality that brought him back to here? The one big difference which one can see is that here you've had man living in these valleys for many thousands of years, and they have bit by bit brought the valley, at least the base of the valley, into cultivation, and they've edged up the side of the hill as far as they felt they could accommodate with nature. But that management, that accommodation between the community which lived in those valleys and the mountains themselves is curiously the thing which modern man is looking for. Because modern man has lost something. He's not, for the most part, particularly religious anymore, and he doesn't know what he's here for. He doesn't know what place he has in the universe. But when he comes out and looks at these valleys with these little communities, these little farms, which have been so carefully nestled into a place out of the weather, and which have taken on the better land in the valley and cultivated, there is there an accommodation between nature and man which speaks to them, and which I think spoke to Woodrow Wilson.
We're going to be a chip on the shoulder of what Wainwright described as one of the grandest objects in Lakeland. He was never keen on the local name, Saddleback, preferring to call it Blencathra. And there's no doubt it has a moody presence. As A.W. put it, there's nothing inviting in the shattered cliffs and petrified rivers of stone that seem to hold a perpetual threat over the little communities below. So we're going to turn down the invitation and instead simply admire the spectacle as we stroll up Blencathra's right arm to find a route that will take us to some of the loneliest hidden gems of northern Lakeland.
Well, when Alfred Wainwright came this way first in about 1959, He was in uncharacteristic grumpy mood. He was bemoaning the preponderance of do-gooding busybodies in the hills. But he said if we did have to invent yet another organisation, the one he wished to invent was the Mouselet Drainage Board, to drain the bog that he had to wade through knee-deep to be able to get into the coombe. Well, they haven't drained it, but they did take some notice, the old lad. They've put down duck boards. At this stage, you're going to have to take my word for it. But these are the duck boards to heaven. You've heard of the perfect storm. Well, in my book, this is the perfect coombe. We may only be a spit away from the busy traffic of the A66, but we're entering a sort of Alice through the looking glass world. We're entering a space warp. The coombe itself is like a crooked finger beckoning us into the hills.
We're entering what Wainwright called his dreamland, the place where A.W., the accountant and borough treasurer, could wipe the balance sheet clean and leave only the figures that really mattered. Bowfell 2960, Squawfell Pike 3210, those sorts of enduring figures. On a Saturday morning, he would set off on an excursion like this, and he often told me that within the hour, what had seemed like a problem on Friday night had evaporated with the morning mist. Here the sheep were real, not time-servers, but then he always rather preferred animals to people, particularly noisy people.
Well, if it only had been like that when we were on Great Mell Fell yesterday. Isn't that magical? But I'm too hot. Coat's going to have to come off, I think. Hey, Jess. You see what I mean about remote? Dozens of people up there on the top. And we have this one to ourselves.
The dog copes remarkably well with these ramblings, really. Her normal response is to take herself off into the bracken about 20 feet away until sanity returns, or her walking companion subsides into breathlessness again. Pretending he's not, of course, by stopping yet again to look at the view. We'll see an awful lot of breathless views on this walk.
Here, Jess. Jess!
And then we're out into the wide skies, on the saddle below Notts and high above the valley of the river Glendurham-Mackin.
Here, Jess. Jess. Here, Jess. Jess. Come. Sit down. Sit. Go, go. Go, go. Now, while I've got this summit to myself, well, okay, I have to share it with a small but reasonably well-behaved film crew. While I've got this place to myself, a mile and a half to the northwest, we're into serious tourist honeypots. Constant straggle of chatterers heading for the sharp edge ascent onto Blencathra. Now, there's no doubt about it, sharp edge is impressive, a bit scary in wild weather, but we've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. On this walk, we're looking for solitude. So we're heading north, out over Bannerdale Crags and into the wilderness of the Callbeck Fells.
Bannerdale once echoed to the picks and shovels of the lead miners, but those hardy souls have long gone. It's uninhabited and scarcely visited these days, but the old mine road's still there and offers an easy, lonely march from the hamlet of Bungrisdale to the foot of the 2,230 feet Bannerdale Crags. But the route we've chosen is the high-level path, across the smooth tops of Whitehorse Bent, round the rim of the crags, and keeping ahead of the cloud starting to pile in from the southwest.
Well, we're up here in the cloud on Balladale Crags, and I tell you, it's 2 top coats and a set of thermals colder up here. There's actually ice on the puddles back along the track, probably the first intimations of a Lakeland winter. But this place, up here on the rim of shattered rock, it's a mile long, plunging away into Balladale. Up here is a great place to tell ghost stories. And yet surprisingly, the ghosts were not here on Balladale Crags themselves, but over there on Souter Fell. It's said that on Midsummer's Eve 1735, and then again in 1737, and again just before the rebellion in 1745, the good residents of Mungrisdal saw on Souter Fell a ghost army, rank upon rank of troops with their cavalry officers, and they marched for well over an hour along the top of the fell. It's not reported whether or not these sightings were from the door of the pub in Mungrisdal, mind you.
Maybe because we were stone sober and extremely cold, maybe because it wasn't Midsummer's Eve. Neither Jess nor I saw even a hint of the ghost army, I've got to say. But I hope the top of Souter Fell is a great deal less boggy than the ascent to Bowscale Fell, which we're tackling next. If not, I don't give much for the ghost army's chances of staying in step or keeping their feet dry.
Well, Bowscale Fell used to be immensely popular in Victorian times. Ladies and gentlemen in all their finery would make a pilgrimage to it. In recent years it's been considered too remote, too inaccessible, too far away from the greater delights of central Lakeland, as A.W. put it, which all goes to prove that the Victorians had more taste than we have, because just a couple of 100 yards in that direction is one of the undisputed gems of Lakeland. And this is what the Victorians came to see, Bowscale Tarn. Mythology tells us it's the home of 2 immortal fish. Wordsworth wrote the story. It's said that on clear, still nights you can see the stars reflected in Bowscale Tarn. Some writers might not agree with him, but Wainwright believed it was quite simply the finest tarn in Lakeland. I certainly can't think of any better place to stop to have your sandwiches. When I've finished mine, I'm going to be heading off in that direction. Oh, I see we've got a solitary walker on the hill. Along that ridge, dropping away into the headwaters of the Caldew, and then turning left up that valley, where I'll be turning the pages on a chapter of Lakeland industrial history. Come on, girl. Are you on for a swim then, Jess? Eh? Bet you are. Oh, the restraint. Oh. Well, you know, there's a wealth of wildlife in these hills and valleys. The one thing you won't find is a single brass monkey. You know, oh, come off. Ooh, that water's cold. Mind you, I think even if we were doing this in the height of summer, that water would be cold. Still, vital thing to carry with you on these walks, a towel. You never know which bit of your anatomy you're going to have to dry. One thing that this area, this confluence of the 2 becks, was famous for was its shepherd's meets in the old days. Every year the shepherds from, well, in this area, Skidder, Callbeck, Bowscales, Carrick Fell, Callbeck Fells, they would all meet up at shepherd's meets, where they would gather the sheep in, they would all sort out their own, put them into little groups and take them home again. Well, the shepherd's meet happened on a Monday, but the shepherds used to come up here on a Saturday and make a weekend of it. There's a place just round the corner there called the Hog House, which was notorious for its rather drunken gatherings. And you do wonder when you read the stories about the shepherds in the old days of how they actually managed to get their sheep home. In fact, did they ever manage to get their sheep home? You can imagine that they came over the hill with none. They were all gathered neatly. They had their bottle of whiskey each. They all went back over the hill, starting off with 20 or 30 sheep. And when they got home, they had none again. I've always assumed it was a bit like that anyway. Ooh, at least the circulation's coming back to my feet. How was it for you?
To some, these workings are a scar on the beautiful face of Lakeland, the moustache on the Mona Lisa. But they're not. They're the calloused hands of honest toil set in stone.
Wainwright was almost as fascinated with the industrial history of these remote corners of Lakeland as he was by the landscape itself. And man has been digging away at these landscapes for more than 500 years. In the 16th century they were mining for copper and lead up here in Brandy Gill. Then they discovered arsenic, and then finally wolframite, the raw material from which they extract tungsten. And tungsten is very war dependent. There were boom times here during the First World War, the Second World War when supplies were cut off in Burma, again during the Korean War when the international trade in tungsten was disrupted. For a while the mines here would flourish and then just as quickly fade away. But the remains of them are a reminder of centuries of hard graft in these hills.
At the end of their 6-day working week, some of the miners of Brandy Gill would make their way home across the mountains to villages like Heskett Newmarket, wearily home by way of High Pike. By rights, we ought to have more of a spring in our step when we follow in their tracks. And if we need a bit of inspiration to push us on, we can always look over our shoulder to try to catch a glimpse of the highlight of this day's remote walk. Bowscale Tarn, perhaps catching the evening light and trapped in time like the immortal fish behind a glacial moraine. Spoil heap to spoil heap, dust to dust. Yesterday afternoon we went exploring the Carrick mines. This morning, under leaden skies, we're heading for Rowton Gill, another of those corners of embalmed industrial Lakeland where sweat and hope took a pristine primeval landscape and tamed it in the hope of fabulous riches. At first sight, the waterfall-filled ravine looks as if it's going to be an energetic scramble. But then generations of hard rock miners used to do it before a day's work. So what have we got to complain about?
Yeah. Ever since the days of the Mines Royal in Elizabethan days, they've been scrambling for mineral wealth in Rowton Gill. Lead, copper, zinc. For a while they even mined umber to use as a pigment. And I can't imagine as many smart painters came this way when there were 100 people labouring in this gill. These hills are honeycombed with shafts and adits, and the most peculiar names too. The Mexico levels. Now, why would anybody in their right senses call something in the hills above Callbeck the Mexico levels? Well, it turns out it's an amalgam of the names of the owners of the day, the Meriwether-Dixon Company. Like prospectors in the American West, they backed their hunch, they pushed on, fired by the prospect of vast wealth, and then eventually they took out the last shovelful of winnable lead and they hit a wall of worthless rock. Like all mining, it ended in tears. Come on, just. Let's try and do this next bit a bit more elegantly. Yes, so. And then we come to the blockage. It's a spot where it looks as if some giant set a tantrum and thrown his marbles in the beck. Well, in drier weather, our route goes straight up that beck bottom. But with this amount of water running, and given I haven't lost all of my marbles and don't want wet feet for the 6 miles from here to Bassenthwaite, I've decided I'm going to go the steeper, but at least dry route up and round the crag. Come on, Jeff, where are you? Whoa!
And it's steep, crabbing from sheep track to sheep track up a 1-in-2 slope with nothing but a grazed backside, or worse, between you and the beck bottom 100 feet below you. But if you can keep your footing, your nerve and your breakfast, there are compensations. Views out across the Solway Plain to where less fortunate souls are having to work today.
Come on. This way. Yes. I don't know why I was worrying about getting my feet wet in Rowton Gill, paddling about ankle deep in sphagnum moss. And the drizzle started too. And then we're out in a trackless waste of peat bog. Now, I don't want to sound as if I'm lecturing, but there's just 2 or 3 things I'd like to say about this walking business. First of all, make sure you check your route on a map before you leave home and let somebody know where you're going and when you expect to be back. And also learn how to use a map and compass, because the weather can change very, very fast up here, and that's the only way you'll find your way off the hill. But the other thing is, don't feel you have to slavishly follow the route that we've suggested, because we chop and change that ourselves. By rights, you see, our route ought to be coming up the bottom of this gill here, and then straight up to the top of the knot. But there's so much water in the beck, we've decided to take a slightly easier, if squelchy, peaty route out to the saddle here, and then we'll gently walk out along the ridge to the summit. Oh, and the other thing, when you're looking at your map and you see the little line of green dots which show the rights of way in these upland areas, don't for 1 minute believe that they bear any resemblance at all to the footpaths, which go their own sweet way. Make up your own route, enjoy it, to the top.
Now here's an oddity. I've always called the summit we're heading for the Knot, but I'm obviously wrong. The master calls it simply Knot, and as he worked out not one but 4 ascents of its 2,329 feet during his explorations in 1961, I'd better bow to his greater knowledge.
Well, it's certainly bracing up here, as they used to say about Skegness, except up here we really mean it. And look at this view. This is High Pike. We came down off there last night. Out along the ridge, Carrick Fell. It's not on our route, but it's worth a detour because there's an Iron Age settlement on Carrick Fell. Down across the plain, and we're on to Bowscale. That glorious tarn is just behind that little lit ridge there in the Coombe. Out along the summit, you can see just a touch there of Bannerdale Crags. We were in cloud when we were on there. Right again, in the far distance is High Street, lit on the horizon. Then we're up to the great silhouette of Blencathra. Right of Blencathra, in the distance, Steel Fell. A little glimmer of light on Thirlmere, this side of Thirlmere, Raven Crag. Then we're round again, and on the far horizon, you can see a bit of light behind it. We've got Dow Crag and Coniston Old Man. In the middle distance, the dark mass there, that's Lonscale Fell. And here in the foreground, again, on our route, this is Great Calver. A little man sitting amongst giants, but with wonderful views. And then beyond that, on the far horizon, you've got Bowfell, Eskpike. You can scarcely see the Scorefell range. I think they've got snow falling there already. There's a little bit of a hint of Gable. We're round then to Skidder Little Man, Skidder itself with its snowy top, and we drop away into Bassenthwaite, and we hopefully will get to Bassenthwaite before the snow gets us.
Having set out through the waterfalls of Rowton Gill, we end our day with an even more spectacular display of unbridled water power in a valley dominated by the ominously named Dead Crags. And even if the light starts to disappear, and even if you're desperate to get to Bassenthwaite to rest weary legs after 11.5 miles, I bet you won't be able to resist pausing here for a while, to marvel at nature white in tooth and claw.
But before we turn our backs on the hill for another day, there's one final spectacle for your delectation. This is the top of Whitewater Dash. To paraphrase Wainwright, the beck that drains the great wastes of the Skidder Forest, at this point gets its first glimpse of proper pastures down there in the valley bottom. And it leaps over a lip of rock into a series of cascades that thunder and tumble to the valley floor. When it's in spate, you can hear the deep roar of those cataracts many miles away at the end of the valley. This is the dessert, the icing on the cake of a day in which the main course was high, wide and handsome views.
We're on our way to challenge a graceful peak, piercing the western sky. Grisdale Pike and its lieutenants tower out of the Whinlatter Forest. They rise into clear skies and offer incomparable distant views. Except today, they don't. We've hit the meteorological buffers with a vengeance. And this is fell walking in all its lunatic glory. They're scenes we've often experienced, but which you rarely see recorded, because no one's daft enough to take the camera out of the bag. This is a water in every crevice sort of day. It leaves you steaming gently, and in imagination at least, smelling rather like damp dogs, begging Jess's pardon.
Now, I don't want you to get the impression that we're having a swan about on this 190-mile walk. The weather's been just like this all the way across Broomfell and Lord's Seat. So bad we couldn't film on either summit. I'm afraid that electronics takes even worse to this weather than geriatrics. Now, Wainwright was always a bit sniffy about forests. You remember what he said about Ennerdale, the dense black blanket of trees obscuring his beautiful valley. He didn't like people straying off the tracks into the woods either. Warned them of the ghastly privations they would suffer in dense jungle, that they would emerge, if at all, in rags. Fearsome. Well, the forest's not like that these days. These woodlands are managed as much for amenity and walkers as they are for timber production. And the very best amenity of all is it gives some modicum of shelter from this truly horrible weather. Well, what do you reckon, girl? We're going to call it a day or plunge on through it?
We take the plunge into the heather and scree of the ascent of Grisdale Pike, resigned to coming back another day to take the pictures. And this is the way things would look if the storm gods weren't out in force. The Vale of Lawton from Hobcarton End on the way out to Grisdale Pike. Cloud, but gentle, appealing cloud, this time pouring across Lord's Seat, back along our route. The ridge from Grisdale Pike across Hobcarton Crags towards Hopegill Head. Grisdale Pike itself on the most glorious of sunny mornings, with views away to the west and hints of Whiteside behind Hopegill Head and Ladyside Pike. Now, for some reason, it wasn't quite like that by the time I'd buffeted and dripped my way to the top of the pike. Oh, there was the odd tantalising glimpse of something, fleeting, unidentifiable, through rips in the cloud. There was Cold Comfort Mountain. There was rain-lashed discomfort. There was the jungle drumming of the gale in the ears. What there wasn't was any prospect of an expedition to Hopegill Head and Whiteside through the thundering grey emulsion. Not for me, the delights of Hobcarton Gill. No chance of looking east to find distant views of placid Derwentwater beyond the dwarfed summits of Stile End and Outer Side. I'll have missed stately Eel Crag and the hints of drifts of hail on Grassmoor. Won't get a chance to scan the ridges from Coaldale Hawes to Hopegill Head. And I certainly wouldn't be able to look to distant horizons to see what our journey onwards through remote Lakeland has to offer. There's no chance of studying the ridge of Whiteside, to marvel at the crags of Melbrake rising sheer from Crummockwater. If the weather had lifted, we might see Gasgale Gill and Coaldale Hawes and Causey Pike. But it won't, and we can't. So we'll never know that taking centre stage in the far silhouette of mountains beyond Melbrake is our objective for the day after tomorrow. The lonely and mysterious Grike. Maybe tomorrow will be better. We might just catch a glimpse of the things we set out to see. In the meantime, I think it's probably a good idea to try to get off the mountain.
Well, I warned you on day one we could expect to get a bit wet during parts of this walk. I just hoped we'd manage to get beyond day 4 before we got our soaking. But look on the bright side. At least you've had a chance of views from Whiteside and Hopegill Head, more than I've had. The weather drove me off the hill. I've had to come down through Gasgale Beck. I have to go back another day to get those views that you've seen. So in the meantime, just relax, sit back, put your feet up, make yourself a cup of tea. Sorry, just a little bit of rain there, and enjoy the rest of the walk. Just watch me suffer.
There are those who say that this is the finest mountain in the Lake District. Now, I think that's going a bit far, but it's certainly a great climb and one of the highlights of remote Lakeland.
Well, it's a sharp autumn morning, a bit of moisture in the breeze. We're probably going to be wet by the end of the day. The fell forecast says it's freezing at 3,000 feet, but that isn't going to bother us because we're heading for the warmer, the Stony Pyramid of Melbrake.
What makes Melbrake quite so special is its isolation, aloofness almost. Owing no debt to the other high ground in the area, you can imagine it looking down its sharp nose at bigger but less perfectly formed chunks of rock. And it's steepish, which means that in next to no time, the low country around it tilts into view, lows water catching the morning light. On the far horizon, Whiteside and Hopegill Head and Grassmoor glower. Now, there are all sorts of ways onto Melbrake, steep and daft from Crummockwater, muddy and a bit tedious from Buttermere. But we're following the Master's progress. This is Wainwright's preferred ascent.
Now then, there are a number of ways to the top of Melbrake, all of them steep. There's the Wimp's route, goes away out to the left here, cuts across diagonally and then cuts back into the summit. Or there's this one, straight up. And on the principle of concentrated pain being better than pain prolonged, it's this one for me. Oh, and be gentle with me when I get to the top.
Maybe it wasn't such a clever idea after all. Or maybe I just need to lose a bit of weight before I go ballet dancing on shifting scree. Yes, dog, I do realise that this is to ballet dancing what Attila the Hun was to humanitarian relief. You know, I bet they're just hoping that I slide all the way back to the bottom. And I could yet. But if you manage rather better than me to raise your eyes from the toe of the boot that's just about to lose its grip, there's a quite spectacular landscape, sandwiched under worsening weather and stretching away just behind you.
Well, that's halfway, and quite enough bravado for one day. Which way does the Wimps route go? Oh yes, of course, just follow the film crew.
But then you're shot of the scree, and on rather more manageable paths, up and over a series of promontories perched above the valley, framed by plunging gullies and with a real sense of space and air around you. Catching the sharpening breeze as Melbrake gives you a taste of mountain exhilaration that you'd normally have to climb a lot higher to find. And this is an autumn walk living up to its promise, too. The weathermen have been telling us it's the wettest autumn since 1855 or 1766 or since records began or some such. But between shower and gale, there are windows of the most sparkling and enchanting light, embracing and softening the landforms of Lakeland. Stand at a viewpoint like this, and the world changes before your very eyes. One moment angry, brooding, the next a lyrical landscape confection.
Well, up here on Melbrake you can see why Wainwright made such a thing about the affinity between mountains and lakes. They've developed side by side in the making of the earth. They belong together. The best example of this is provided by Wastwater and the Screes, which of course is going to be dominating our horizon and stirring the imagination during the next 2 days of our walk. But next best is the combination of Melbrake and Crummock Water, essential partners in a successful scenery enterprise. Of course, that side of the lake over there is the busy side. That's where the tents and the people are, where the heavy traffic is in summer. But it's the view across the lake, where the water laps the sterile base of Melbrake far beneath the mountain's dark escarpment, where loneliness, solitude and silence prevail, that makes the scene unforgettable.
And then, just as quickly, the weather's heading for the record books again. Rumbles of thunder, the threat of squally showers lurking behind Red Pike. Time to push on, across the half-mile or so that divides Melbrake's north and south tops, dropping in 250 feet as we go, urged on by the prospect of views far grander than the south summit's 1,676 feet would suggest.
Well, a little shower of hail between the two summits certainly cooled things down a bit. But how about this for a view to warm the soul? Over there, Whiteside, coming round to the great scree-riven mass of Grassmoor with cloud bubbling on the top of it. Further right, in the distance, Wandup, and then coming down to Whiteless Pike, which drops in. The dark ridge beyond that is Knot Rig, running out to Ard Crags. Beyond that, Maiden Moor. On the far horizon is Rays. In the foreground, lit, the little bubbled mound of Ranadale Knots, dropping away into Crummock Water. But if we come right again, following the line of Maiden Moor, Robinson with cloud on the top, again dropping in. The Honister Pass in the middle there, perhaps you can just see through the murk the quarry buildings at the top of the pass. Dropping in on the left, Dale Head, rearing up on the right, Fleetwith Pike, and through the middle, in the middle distance, Rosthwaite Fell. Coming round right again, in the cloud through there is Grey Knots and Brandreth, and coming out of the cloud now you can see Haystacks, much loved by Wainwright, of course his ashes are scattered up there by innominate Tarn, and then High Pike, High Stile and Red Pike. Now our route drops in to the bottom of Red Pike, but we don't go anywhere near that because of course that's not remote Lakeland. We turn right instead, climb out onto Starling Dodd, another climb onto Great Bourne before we drop in to Ennerdale. And then on the way down from Great Bourne we come across this artefact of a lost way of Lakeland life. It's called the Goose Bield. Nothing to do with sheltering geese, although they did used to graze geese in very large numbers upon these fells. In fact, it's a fox trap. The way it would work, the fox would toddle up this ramp of stone conveniently placed behind me. In here would be a plank with a dead chicken or goose on the end of it. The fox would try to reach it, fall in, Bob's your uncle. Don't think it's been used for a year or two. I'm sure if anyone tried to resurrect it these days there'd be a campaign again it. But given that there's a storm forecast tonight with force 8 winds and 1.5 inches of rain, the only Bield I'm interested in at this time of the afternoon is shelter in Ennerdale Bridge. No jests. Come on, this way. Come on, Miguel. Down the hill.
Well, the forecasters were right. The storm came and went, but I was sheltering on a bar stool at the time. And this morning, there's the aftermath. I hit the road a quarter of an hour later than planned, but the downpour has washed the grey clag away. Well, from the landscape anyway. And Ennerdale looks bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, an irresistible invitation to the hill. half a mile out of the village, and we're in a magical countryside. At this time of the morning, 3 of the leaden-legged coast-to-coast walkers that stumble into Ennerdale Bridge for tea and sympathy.
But day 6 begins with some rather sad news. Much as it grieves me to do so, I have to report on the fallibility of Alfred Wainwright. When he first came here in 1965, he wrote this: "It's a remarkable fact that the Kinniside Stone Circle, although a well-known ancient monument, is omitted from Ordnance Survey maps. The explanation seems to be that the Kinniside Stone Circle was non-existent, all 12 stones having long before been taken by local farmers for use as gateposts and building materials. But 40 years ago, a grand job of restoration was accomplished by an enterprising working party, to whom great credit is due. Having cleaned out and measured the sockets in the ground in which the stones were originally set, they searched for and located the original 12, recovered them all, and completely restored the site. Today the circle is exactly as it was when first laid out thousands of years ago, waiting to surprise the next Ordnance Survey team." Well, no actually, waiting to surprise Alfred Wainwright, because some years later he discovered that the Kinniside Stone Circle is entirely fake. It was laid out in the 1920s by a local headmaster and amateur archaeologist. So no one's perfect, not even AW. And I promise that's the only mistake we'll find as we follow in the great man's footsteps out onto the summit of Grike, the place where the Lake District begins in the west. Right, away we go.
Our way out to the first summit of the day, as on so many occasions, is in the footfall of the miners, who were the first modern men to explore these mountains. But then the minerals ran out, or were uneconomic to fight for, and the hills went back to the wilderness from whence they came.
Once you're off the old mine road, you're in a landscape devoid of footpaths. These hills get so few visitors. In fact, the nearest thing you'll find to a footpath is this here. Now, it isn't the mark of the first wave of fell walkers, it's a track made by trail hounds. I think we better head on for the summit before that rain shower catches us up. And this is civilised Grike, with its semicircular shelter to protect us from the prevailing southwesterlies. Now, when Wainwright was writing about this in the 60s, having complained about, as he saw it, the devastation of Ennerdale by forestry, he feared that the forests would spread out onto these hills too. In fact, he wrote in his pictorial guide, in another 20 years, another fox sanctuary will have been created. The landscape will have been drastically altered, and the pages of this guidebook dealing with Grike will be obsolete. Come to think of it, so will the author, God rest his soul. Well, at least so far as Grike is concerned, his worst predictions didn't happen. It's still got these marvellous open views. Away in the distance over here we can catch glimpses of the landscape we've been passing through for the last 2 days. In the far distance, on the far horizon, Whiteside, Hopegill Head in the middle, the whale-shaped back of Grassmoor. In front of those, the outline of Melbreck, and then here in the foreground, Great Bourne with its plunging screes. We came down off there last night. Our route now, though, goes this way, out to the cairn on the horizon there, which is Crag Fell. From there, wonderful views of Red Pike and High Stile. But we're turning away right, going in front of Pillar and Black Crag and Steeple and Scote.
But before we have the luxury of using the Ennerdale wall as a handrail over the tops, we've got the solitary hike to Crag Fell.
Now the joy of Crag Fell isn't the rather predictable and boggy underfoot slopes that give us easy access, but this, the spectacle of Ennerdale. A ring of mountains in dappled sunlight and scudding cloud. But if you want to get the real spirit of Crag Fell, you have to go another couple of 100 yards further on to where sliced pillars of rock plummet towards the valley floor. It's the sort of place that you associate with the really big mountains. But even here in remote Lakeland, it's the sort of place that makes a day on the hill a consummate experience.
But where we're heading is better still. I know I'm biased, but who could possibly disagree that we'll be looking into the best valley head in Britain, Wasdale.
I think it's unique in England in the sense that it's got the remoteness that you want, and it's also much wilder than any other part, of the Lake District. I think it's the mixture of wildness and remoteness, and also the feelings that when the weather comes down and you start to see things through the mist, you see sort of shadows, you see things obviously that aren't there. But I mean, and then all of a sudden the sun breaks through and it's just suddenly stunning. And it's remarkable. Every day is different. Yeah.
To me, it's one of the most magical places in Britain. It's, and whatever the weather's like.
Absolutely, yeah.
Even the most ghastly weather can come up and come up to the head just to, even though you wouldn't be tempted out onto the hill that day, you can, and just the way that the water colour changes and the scree colour changes.
Yeah.
And those glorious magenta screes you get sometimes, in the right lights.
Absolutely. I've also been out in a rescue in foul weather overnight, and it's cleared up as dawn comes in, and dawn on the top looking down into the head of the valley is absolutely stunning. Not that I suggest that everybody does an overnight on Scaffold Pike, but it does have its compensations.
No, because this walk we're doing, the glory of it is that for the vast majority of the time, all right, we're doing it not the very best time of weather of the year, but for the vast majority of the time, you see nobody else.
I think that's true. You can get, the car park can be full here, and if you decide to go up, let's say Kirkfell, or you go up Buckbarrow or Ewbarrow or Steeple or Haycock, you won't see another soul. But if you go to the honeypot of Scaffold Pike, you will be just going up in a caravan of people. And I do think people who come here regularly, know that they can get away from the honeypot, they can always escape to the other fells. And that's another part of the beauty of Wasdale, is that you do have the loneliness of the other fells.
We've made our way over the rolling, rather featureless tops of Seat Allen and Glade Howe before we arrive here at the summit of Buckbarrow. We've done about 12 miles, 4,000 feet of ascent today. But like so many Lakeland mountains, the very best views from Buckbarrow are not from this summit, but from a point 100 yards in that direction, at the top of a cliff that rears out of the Wasdale Valley. Now, come on, after 12 miles, what's another 100 yards? Imagine this place in an age of storm and ice. The whole valley filled with a slow-moving, groaning glacier, scouring rock from Scorefell to the sea, turning mountains that were once the dimensions of the Alps into a gem of a landscape. on a more manageable, more human scale. And what the glacier created, man hasn't made too bad a job of preserving and protecting, has he? So take time to enjoy it. Oh, but also make sure you leave well before dark, because I know you've done 12 miles and 100 yards so far today, but you've got another mile to do, down to the valley and to bed for the night. It's what Wainwright described as a moment of blinding revelation, his first sight of Wasdale. It looks harmless enough this morning, but I've met visitors who took one look at the place and ran for cover, or to be more precise, drove for cover, because of course most visitors to Wasdale come by car, and therefore miss the really scary bits. The stroll out from Nether Wasdale is gentle enough though, through a landscape softened by the plantings of rich Victorian families who bought their Wasdale estates as a retreat from the pandemonium of the Industrial Revolution. The place captivated them. They bought up valley farms to preserve the vernacular architecture and save the Herdwick sheep. Much of the land was passed on to the National Trust, and the essence of Wasdale has survived. And then we reach our first pimple of the day. Now I know there are aficionados of Urton pike that would strenuously object to me describing it as a pimple, but in all truth it is dominated by the giants of mountains at the head of the Wasdale Valley. But like so much of remote Lakeland, what it lacks in sheer bulk, it makes up for with a wealth of delightful complementary views. This is where the fertile coastal plain stretching away to the estuary at Ravenglass over there meets the land of the men of the hills. And it's obviously a remote place because they always put nuclear installations such as the one at Sellafield in remote places, don't they? Over here, the route that brought us in yesterday, there's a long lit ridge of core. In the background, with cloud on its top, Seat Allen, and in the foreground, the dark mass of Buckbarrow Crag dropping away into the valley floor. And then there's Middlefell, Lit, and Ewbarrow, and Kirkfell, and Gable. But our route goes this way, out onto Winrig and Ilgill Head, because, as you know, we've set our face against the tourist honeypots, so when we come off the other end of Ilgill Head, we'll be turning sharp right, ignoring Scorefell and Scorefell Pike, dropping away instead into the Eskdale Valley, where we'll spend the night, before we move on to another marvellous range of outlying hills tomorrow. Oh dear.
The first visitors rather than settlers in Wasdale were painters and poets who came to capture the terror of nature in the raw. We'll feel a bit of that later in the day. But then the railway to Drigg opened these valleys up to a new sort of tourist, a particular type of gentleman in tweeds, with sturdy boots, hemp ropes and classy accents, who were the pioneers of a new sport, climbing. The locals watched them with some amusement. When old Will Ritson, the landlord at the Wasdale Head, was told that a bunch of them were going to shin up the Scorefell Crags, he's reported to have said that "nabbit a fleeing thing could get up there." Mind you, he elaborated the stories of their adventures later, and earned himself the title of the biggest liar in the world. Some good comes out of everything.
Here, Jess. Here, Jess. Here, Jess. Here. Come on. Now sit down. Sit.
But honestly, we've headed out along the ridge, high above Wastwater, to get to the spot where we can experience for ourselves a dose of the picturesque horrors of nature.
And then from Winrig, we're on the ascent out to Ilgill Head. And we arrive at what I like to think of as a sort of desert island discs moment. You know that bit of the programme where of your 8 choices you're only allowed to take one with you? Well, assume that my 8 choices are 8 of my favourite views of the Lake District, and you have to come here, to this corner of the remote lakes, to find the view that I would carry in the mind's eye to the desert island. No, not this view, spectacular as it is, of this wall of decaying rock. This is the view that's seen by most visitors to Wastwater. It's the view from the car parked on the Valley Bottom Road. But to see this place at its very best, you have to come here. You have to look down into this chasm of broken and crumbling rock. If you stand here long enough, you'll hear boulders crashing their way to the bottom. It's a glimpse into a primeval world. It's a really grand place. But just a word of warning, don't try doing this if there's a force 8 blowing off the Irish Sea, or you might just get a bit closer to primeval than you'd planned. Jess. Heel. Good girl. Here, heel. 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 Well, here on the summit of Ilgill Head, we're at 1,983 feet, using Wainwright meticulous measurement. But it's on this grassy top that the terrain dramatically changes. 50 yards in that direction and we're at the top of the vertigo creator. The Cresta run of scree that goes 2,000 feet straight to the boulder field at the bottom of Wastwater. But 50 yards in this direction we're into an altogether more gentle rolling landscape. It'll take us down past Burnmer Tarn and to a night at Boot in Eskdale. Come on, Jess.
This is the sort of desolate, unpretentious tract of land that A.W., after one of his long silences, and mainly we walked in silence, would suddenly bring to life with a few carefully placed anecdotes. The day a cloudburst in Lingmel Gill washed an avalanche of boulders onto the fields that had to be cleared by prisoners of war. The names of the most obscure rocky outcrops that didn't even appear on the maps. Tom Fox's Crag, Bull Howe, Heron Crag. He knew the ground, and he knew the wealth of stories that sprang from it.
We're walking the route of the old Corpse Road. In the days before Wasdale got its own burial ground, the dead used to have to be transported 7 miles across Burn Moor, under the shoulder of Scorefell, across to St Catherine's in Eskdale for burial. Now the ground was too rough for wagons, and so the corpses in their coffins were strapped to pack horses. And the story goes that one particularly stormy night, one of those pack horses was spooked and disappeared, complete with coffin, into the mist, never to be seen again. Well, never to be seen in the flesh, at any rate. Because the story is that on bright moonlit nights, you can still hear spectral galloping out here. So this is definitely a part of the route to be avoided after dark, unless, of course, spectral horses carrying coffins across Lakeland Fells is your thing. I don't know about you, Jess, but I don't believe a word of it.
Well, you know what to say, Jess. Climate's what you expect, and weather's what you get. Well, I think we're about to get weather, and a lot of it.
Anybody who thinks that these hills are somehow part of a natural wilderness is a long way from the mark. If the stone circle we saw at Kinneyside yesterday morning was a fake, then this one and 4 others like it here on Brat's Moss are the real thing. They date from the Bronze Age. Our pollen samples taken across in Burnmer Tarn prove that somewhere around about 5,000 years ago the natural tree cover had already gone from these hills. Now, whether man cleared it deliberately or it was taken off by naturally occurring forest fires, nobody's quite sure. What they do know is that there were so many people here in the Bronze Age that there was pressure on the space in the valleys. Some of the families had to come up here onto the hill. Now, on land that today will support about a sheep to every 3 acres, they once grew cereals. But then, around about 3,500 years ago, there was a dramatic shift in the climate. I know we think that climate change is something we invented, but the Bronze Age people knew about it all too well. Suddenly, it got wetter and colder. The peat began to encroach. The people were forced off the hill back into the valleys. They left behind them the symbols of their belief, their faith, their superstition, and the cremated remains of their ancestors. Well, I'm not sure if it's climate change or the same bloody awful weather that drove Bronze Age man off the hill. But I do know we've had a bit of luck in the shape of the first piece of shelter we've come across since we left Nether Wasdale 10 or so miles ago. It's one of a collection of peat huts above the village of Boot, monuments to the good old days of the 18th and 19th centuries. And whole families would come out here in the summer, they would cut peat, let it dry on the hill, and as autumn approached it would be sledged or barrowed into these buildings, dropped in through a pop hole, stacked inside and kept dry for winter use. You can imagine the scene, some bleak winter's morning. Little Johnny will be told to climb out 600 feet from Boot and bring down a load of peat for the kitchen fire. I'm glad I wasn't around in the good old days, really.